2:01, and so I'd like to officially begin this In Conversation with event. On July 24th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin touched down on the surface of the moon. This was a huge achievement, not only for NASA and the associated corporations, but for the United States of America and for all of humanity. It was a sign of superiority and an event that solidified a political and technological victory against the Soviet Union in what was a long and tiresome space race in the midst of the Cold War. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Will, and I'll be the MC and tech for this session. I'm in grade 10 at the International School of Zug and Lucerne, and I'm a member of the YFS series team. As you know, today's event is about astropolitics. For those that do not know, astropolitics refers to international collaborations, space laws, potential space conflicts, governmental actions regarding space, and many more similar topics. The role of astropolitics is becoming more and more important as governments and private companies are increasing their efforts regarding space exploration. With technology developing exponentially, who knows where we will be in the years to come. Which is why as a team, we really hope that our time together today will be a valuable opportunity for everyone to hear from and interact with leading change makers and inspiring experts. For those who want to take part in the discussion here today, you can ask your homeroom teacher to leave a question using the chat function located on Zoom. Secondly, please make sure all your mics are muted throughout the course of the event so that we have no accidental disruptions. Before we begin, Professor Logsdon and Professor Hertzfeld would like to give a short introduction to themselves. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome both Professor John Logsdon and Professor Henry Hertzfeld.
Well, as the older of the two of us, I'll go first. I'm a retired professor emeritus at George Washington University. I started the Space Policy Institute. Henry will describe a little bit in more detail what that institute is in 1987. Left full-time faculty in 2008. Since then, have been writing a series of books on the presidential decisions that have shaped the U.S. space program. John Kennedy, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and I'm continuing to do that in my pandemic-induced isolation in my home office. I look forward to talking to you today. Henry?
Thanks, John. I've been, John, as you heard, actually founded the Space Policy Institute over 30 years ago at George Washington University, and we are within the Elliott School of International Affairs. The Institute is a research institute. We're small, but we have several professors. I've been director for the last 4 years, and it's been really a pleasure to be there. I've been there for over 25 years, and we do independent research. In other words, we work together on some things, but we do our own research. My particular field of expertise is in economics and law, so I actually teach a course in space economics and one in space law. But the Institute is integrally tied to a program in international science and technology policy, and there's an MA graduate program in that area with a specialty in space policy. So for the students out there, when you get out of college, you might want to look at, if you're interested in space laws or in space policy, and all of the other topics underneath it, you might want to take a look at us. It's a 2-year program with a master's program with degree at the end. And we deal with many other topics, and it's a very interesting and exciting area to be in, as you'll see from our discussion as we move ahead. And from my perspective, particularly the areas of economics with the newer companies coming into the field of space, it's no longer just government programs. And of course, with that are a number of legal issues that are still unsolved. So it's an exciting area to explore. It's changing fast, and it's something that is going to be more important as we move along in time. with that, I'll turn it back to our MCs and look forward to your questions.
Thank you both, Professor Logson and Professor Hertzfeld, for giving us a short introduction to yourselves. I'd like to now introduce our host and interviewer for this session, Guy Moroney, a fellow 10th grade student at the International School of Zug in Lucerne.
Thanks, Will. As you said, I'm Guy and I'm a grade 10 student. It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Logson and Professor Hertzfeld to this YFS in Conversation with event. As we heard from Will's introduction, it's a real privilege to be able to spend some time with two people who have achieved such great things in the field of space politics. And I really hope we can all learn a lot during this event. So let's officially begin this in conversation with our very first question. So to start it off, some people within the audience may feel as discussions about space are unnecessary or of the distant future, and when the many problems that we have today on Earth, which have been explored in other YFS panels today, are irrelevant. So to start this conversation off, could you perhaps tell us why you both think we should presently care and discuss the future of space exploration and engage in space politics as a topic?
Well, let me start again as the older of us. First of all, space is an area for human activity, and lots of different things go on in outer space. Professor Hertzfeld may want to talk about it. First of all, it's not a formal definition of where the atmosphere ends and where outer space begins, but usually about 100 kilometers above the Earth. Things that are vital to our everyday life, like smartphones, depend on signals from the global positioning satellites and other networks, Galileo in Europe. We communicate via satellites. There are Earth observation satellites that predict the weather, predict famine, help ameliorate the impacts of disasters. So there are things that go on space that are essential to everyday life. Then there is a military space program effort around the world, which is aimed at contributing to national power and national security, and hopefully international well-being and stability. So the military in at least the leading space countries is very active as an element of overall military posture. And then there is space exploration. That's really a separate activity. That's going places, discovering new things. There are 3 missions on their way to Mars that will land in the next month, one from the United States, one from China, one from the United Arab Emirates, missions of exploration. Their telescope will be launched later this year. That's a US-European collaboration called the James Webb Space Telescope that will look back in time as it looks out into the cosmos and give us information we don't now have about the origins and evolution of the universe. So space is a place where lots of exciting, interesting, and valuable things happen, and therefore well worth talking about.
Just building on what Professor Logston has just outlined, I think it's important to remember that a lot of the benefits, a lot of the things that we get from space are not always apparent in our daily life, but they're there. When you see your GPS locations, whether it's in your car or the smartphone or on your computer, that's coming from a satellite 12,000 miles above the Earth. And actually it's a series of many satellites in that orbit. But we don't think about the satellites. We see the picture and we like the idea, we know where we're going or where we happen to be standing or sitting. But when you look at television every night, you often see a map of the area you're living in, and it's a satellite image of clouds and storms. But do we think about everything that's behind it? The launch of that satellite, the operation of the satellite, keeping it in place, as well as receiving the signals back here on Earth and then transmitting them to the receiver. There are other hidden things. The GPS satellites, of course, or Galileo in Europe, and there's some others in other countries. They're actually called in the space language PNT, position, navigation, and timing. And the timing is very important. It's used, as Professor Logsdon said, in coordinating cell phones and other types of communications, but your electricity distribution, water supply, many other things, both in government functions and even industry, rely on those signals these days to synchronize all of their services. So that a lot of things you don't see have become very, very important in the space arena. I will also want to add that, yes, we certainly, our militaries do rely on space for some things, but we have, and we'll get to this later, I think, in the conversation, some space treaties. And they call for space to be used for peaceful purposes, and not to fight wars. On the other hand, there are things that we can do in space, such as observing the world and other countries, and telecommunications that are essential to security operations as well. So almost everything in space has what we call dual uses, both civilian uses and uses for national security. Even though that we have principles that want to keep space as a place for exploration, for learning about the universe, and for helping benefits to individuals here on Earth.
That's true. I guess I never thought about how really everything in space affects day-to-day life on Earth. So now that
let me add that a good part of that dependence, particularly in the non-military area, has matured and developed in the last 15 or 20 years. So that earlier on, we were talking about space mainly as a research and development area. We're learning how to use it. And that was a major activity. Today, we are still learning, of course, and it's a very important element of all of this, but we're also using space in a much more sophisticated and mature way in our economies than we did many years ago.
Yeah, again, yeah, that's all very true. And I guess you really have to change your mind in the way you consider space when you think about all those things. So now that we've heard about why space politics is so important for our lives, Professor Hertzfeld, how do you think the exploration of space can have a positive impact on global relations? Could it unite countries together and enforce positive change? Or perhaps would it negatively affect influence relations?
Well, first of all, I think the principle of international cooperation is built into the space treaties. So, and nations do take that seriously where they can. And an awful lot, excuse me, of the science and of the research part of this that I was describing is done quite cooperatively. We also have a need, particularly growing these days. You've read a lot about space debris, the possibility of accidents up there. We've been very lucky, but also skillful in that we haven't had the perfect storm, the really bad accident up there. Yes, satellites have collided, but it's only a few, and it's not been a major issue yet, but we're looking ahead, and it could be. What that means is space is global. Every nation is involved, and so there is an effort, and I think it's a real one to work together. Because if we have a bad accident up there, every nation, everybody there can lose. So it's only to our advantage to cooperate in some ways in space. And we do in many ways. Frankly, when we have disagreements, and sometimes, as we all know, they've led to wars, they're terrestrial. It's disagreements among governments. Would we have a war in space? I don't think so. But given the importance of space assets to, as we described earlier, to everybody, both civil and military, it is quite clear that if we do have disagreements with other nations and they do escalate, space assets will be involved. So I would emphasize that to avoid that, we need better cooperation politically on Earth. We can cooperate in space. We always have with other nations. If you go back, remember we had a space race in the during the Cold War, but we also had the Apollo-Soyuz program. We docked up in space in the middle of the Cold War with a Soviet spacecraft, and naturally in such a very difficult operating environment, technical cooperation was also involved, not just the say, oh, we're going to go up and shake hands and meet up there. It's not that easy. So that we have, and I hope we continue to cooperate with other nations.
That's very true. Professor Logsdon, do you have anything to add on the topic?
Let me build on that a little bit. I mean,
Mhm.
the most visible, literally visible, if you know where to look, example of international cooperation is the International Space Station.
Absolutely.
With 15 countries from Europe, from Canada, from Japan, and the United States working together, and Russia, working together and operating this orbital laboratory. My understanding is that most of the people watching this discussion are in high school. Do you realize that since you've been born, there's always been at least 2 people living off the planet? The space station has been inhabited by 2 or more astronauts since the year 2000. So we are beginning to be a interplanetary species, or at least a non-Earth species. Work and the space station includes former adversaries like Russia and the United States. The one kind of glaring example is that China is not yet a participant, probably won't be, given that the station is nearing the end of its lifetime. China is launching its own space station. But international cooperation is woven into the thread of most things that happen in space, certainly in the scientific area. But it's still, there's competition, there's economic competition, there's political competition, there's military competition, interwoven with a fabric of cooperation. And the countries of the world, as Professor Hertzfeld said, are going to have to work together to set up rules for how we do things in space. Several companies are launching thousands of small satellites for communications purposes. We're going to have a traffic problem in space, and so the idea of space traffic management is a pressing issue in space policy, which will be settled through a political process. So there's lots happening. It's an exciting time in space.
Let me just also add about the space station, which is actually, it's been around a long time. We've worked on this since building it since the 1990s, and even before that. It's a partnership among 14 nations. It's not just a US space station. And there is a negotiated formal space station agreement with a lot of the rules of the how you operate. And behind that, there's a code of conduct for the astronauts on the space station. And all of the partners have agreed on this. It's been a living document. Obviously, these partnerships, the politics, everything else has changed over over the years that it's been in operation. And so have some of the agreements. There is an international committee that meets. and makes amendments and tweaks the agreements to meet new conditions. So it's a living document and a living space station as well. And you know, and actually that space station agreement is as one of the documents that has that will be used as precedent as we move ahead with going to the moon with international cooperation. The United States wants to do this with other nations, and it looks as though we will. As you know, a number of nations have signed on to some initial accords that will lead to that program. China, as Professor Logsdon said, is going in its own route, but nonetheless, when we come to actually operating, maneuvering in space, we have to be in touch with the Chinese, even if they're not formally partners with our programs moving ahead.
Professor Logsdon, I couldn't help but notice the fact you mentioned competition, military competition regarding space, which is interesting considering that the United States has recently founded a new Space Force, a new and exciting branch of the Air Force. And Donald Trump claimed in these exact words that will help ensure US dominance in outer space. So as someone who has worked for governmental programs before, what do you think about this remark?
Well, fortunately, Mr. Trump is gone. And with his departure, talking about dominance is much less in the forefront than it was during his 4 years as president. The Space Force reflects the importance of space capabilities in national security. And yes, the United States has taken steps to organize itself for space with a separate service that's technically still part of the Air Force, but really is rather separate from the Air Force. And the Air Force doesn't like it, by the way, losing the space function to a separate military. It recognizes the importance in US military strategy of space assets. Whether it evolves into a war fighting body, well, that depends on others, I think. We're not anywhere close to Star Wars, and space stormtroops. It is operating the GPS. The GPS, the Global Positioning Satellite, is a military system. It serves as a public utility for everybody, but it's owned and operated by the Space Force. Observation satellites. So there is, and other countries have already organized their military space activities in a separate organizational format. So the fact that the Space Force has been created in the United States has gotten, I think, a little out of proportion of what it really is. It is not an attempt to weaponize space. It's an attempt to be more effective in using space to provide security for the United States and for the rest of the world.
Let me add to that and maybe say pretty much the same thing in slightly different words. The U.S. military, of course, as Professor Logsdon described, does a lot of things in space, and in observation and communications and other areas. A lot of it was scattered throughout the Defense Department. And in a way, you can look at the Space Force as a way of consolidating a lot of different areas and an organizational change within the Defense Department. So that most of the things that are there now have been actually going on for many years, mainly in the areas we described. And it's the Defense Department. We are not, it's not offensive in its operations. It wants to protect the US interests in space. And so how it evolves, we don't know over many years. But today, it is more of a reorganization within the Defense Department than it is something brand new.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. And also earlier, you two mentioned China going a different route than the US. And that's interesting considering that during the Cold War, the USSR and the United States were head-to-head in a competitive space race. In present times, on the verge of a new space race, do you think the Americans should worry about going into a race with superpowers such as China, who have far more resources and are economically stronger than the USSR? And if so, why should they be worried?
Well, I think the situation is very different. The space race was an element of the global competition between the United States and the former Soviet Union. And it was the Soviet Union that said, because we do things first in space, shows that we're the superior form of society and organization. And the United States responded to that challenge by saying, well, we're going to go to the moon to show that we're more powerful, more technologically advanced, a better way of organizing society. The relationship between the United States and China is not a level of hostility that was characteristic of the Cold War. It's mainly competition in the economic field and secondarily political competition. I mean, the Chinese clearly believe in the strength of their way of life and society and are trying to influence countries around the world to ally with them, as the United States is with capitalist democracy. But China has not made space an indicator of its national power in the same way as the Soviet Union did, has not challenged the United States to compete in space. And so I don't think there is a space race. I think there's competition, but a race has a finish line. And sure, there's competition, but that competition is healthy to do things, difficult and challenging things. So yes, there is space competition for achievement, not a space race. And I don't think the main motivation for China is what the US does. I don't think the main motivation for the United States should be what China does. Each of them are seeking their own objectives.
Professor Hertzfeld, do you have anything to add on this topic? Professor Hertzfeld, you're muted. Okay, you're meant to be muted. Anyway, it is now 2:30, so that's the end of the time we have for the questions that we have prepared. So I would now like to hand it back over to Will for some audience questions that we have gathered.
Thank you, Guy. So the first question I have, someone from the audience has, is who owns the moon? This follows more under space policy, but space policy tends to fit under space politics.
It's really a space law question. Henry, are you back on? We've lost his audio, I guess. Professor Hertzfeld has really written a lot about lunar property rights. The existing treaties say that the moon and other celestial bodies are not subject to national sovereignty or appropriation. So that basically means you can't go to the moon, plant a flag, and say it's now part of whoever did that, in this case, the United States. But whether that prohibition extends to any kind of property right so that someone could go and extract lunar resources is an open question under active debate. And one of the things that space lawyers spend a lot of time discussing. So there is no definitive answer to your question, who owns the moon?
Will, should we move on to another audience question?
Okay, I'm unmuted now.
Okay.
Okay, great. So do you have any input on the last question? Who owns the moon?
I was trying to get muted. Please just summarize it quickly for a second.
Well, the question, we have an audience question coming in, which is just who owns the moon?
Oh, okay. Well, the bottom line, at least from space law, is that nobody owns the moon and everybody owns it together. The Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty says that no nation may claim sovereignty, may appropriate the moon or celestial bodies. So that that doesn't mean we can't explore. It doesn't mean we can't use in the context of exploration the moon. And the same rights are available to any nation. Exactly how we use it is a subject of legal and economic and political discussion these days. What are those rights, and what can we do up there? Keep in mind that the United States, Russia, Soviet Union before, but Russia, and have been to the moon. China has been to the moon and landed successfully. US and Russia have brought back samples from the moon for scientific purposes. So we have, if you want to use the word, I don't like it much, mine the moon. Yes, we've obtained resources up there. There's a US law that was passed in 2015 that says if a company goes, at least a US company, they can have some rights to those, the resources that they obtain there. How they obtain them has not been described yet. So there's plenty of room for discussion, but I think it's clear that humanity, regardless of what nation it will be, has the technology to return samples and to use things in space. And this will be a continuing discussion. There's a body within the UN called the UN COPUOS, the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and they are about to take up this discussion at some point when after pretty much the things have been put on hold with the pandemic, but the discussion goes on, and it will be discussed in legal forums and in world bodies, and hopefully we'll get some agreement on how we can sustainably use resources in space. And what we mean by sustainability is safely and observing the rights of all nations at the same time. Not an easy task, but it's on the agenda.
Thanks. So another question we have from the audience asks, what is the difference between private companies such as SpaceX and the government with NASA? And by the way, to all audience members, if you want to send questions, make sure you direct them to either me or Will using the chat.
I'll start on that one. They are, of course, inextricably linked together because one of the major customers of SpaceX, for example, and other private companies is the government. So there is an inherent partnership in there, but companies also have the ability to do things on their own. If you go into space, though, nations can be ultimately liable and responsible for what happens there from both their own governmental agencies, NASA and the weather satellites and the Defense Department and so on. They're internationally responsible and also internationally liable if something goes wrong. In other words, ultimately, it's the state that's responsible, which sets up a system of licensing and supervision and authorization from governments to the private companies. So they have to get permission to launch and to do things in space. And it's up to the government, each government, how they handle those permissions. But they are all within a framework of international law.
Professor Logsdon, do you have anything to add on the topic?
Well, I mean, the point of private sector companies is to make a profit. Point of government is to provide benefits for their citizens. So they're fundamentally organizations with fundamentally different purposes. The private sector in recent years has figured out that there is money to be made by doing various things in space. And so it's becoming, there's a kind of exponential growth in private investment in space activities, which poses, as Professor Hertzfeld says, a challenge to government in how governments both encourage and regulate what goes on in space. So what will happen in the future as we go beyond the so-called space applications like communications and remote sensing, Earth observation, to private operations in space, exploration, perhaps resource extraction on the moon and asteroids, in orbit servicing. There's whole areas of potential private sector activity, and the rules for how they're going to operate have yet to be developed. So that's a very active area of space policy.
I think it's very clear, though, that those rules will be developed and private companies will have the ability to operate just as they do on Earth. But as I said, there are special considerations in space, and the means and the safety sustainability requirements will be substantial on industry. I believe they will be anyway, and they will differ from country to country.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting to hear. So the next question we have from the audience is, how can the companies deploying the thousands of satellites for communication be governed? Can they be governed by national laws, or will they have to be governed by international treaties?
Let me make one point here first. Anything that you put in space, that human beings launch and put in space, is the property either of the nation or the company that puts it up there. As I said, we have rules for industrial operations, but the property is is sovereign territory. Nations have a right to protect that property. So the fact that we have a problem of managing space so that we don't have accidents up there, so that we all can use it and not interfere with others' operations in space, is a challenge. And putting that many small satellites up there with presumably shorter lifetimes and presumably the ability to maneuver those satellites so that they won't create an accident, creates a management governance, if you like, but I prefer the term management problem to solve. And we have not solved that yet. We still need to know the exact orbits. We need to have all these satellites maneuverable. Not all of them are. And we need more predictability and more assurance that we can use space. Again, going back to the word I used before, sustainably, so that everybody has the option and right to be there and to work together in space safely.
Our next audience question is, how will the increasing activity of private entities impact the present day space operations? Can this complement global peacekeeping efforts?
Well, global peacekeeping is a government responsibility. That's not the business of the private sector. However, there are, for example, there's a company called Planet, which launches very small satellites called Doves and gives every day, every spot on Earth visibility, looking at what's going on. And clearly government peacekeeping operations can use that information for their own purposes by buying it. I mean, that's a business for the company Planet to be in, is selling this imagery. It's high resolution, which means you can see relatively small objects, and say 24/7 every place on Earth. is under observation from orbit. So, there's a synergy between what the private sector can do and what international and national governments want to do, that provides a continuing relationship. Hopefully, companies can make money and the world can stay secure.
Professor Hertzfeld, do you have anything to add?
No, I really don't. Just to point out that at least in the United States, private companies have always been involved in space. Back in the earlier years, from the 1960s on, most of that involvement was under government contract. Today, companies like Planet, SpaceX, and others are selling services, selling those pictures directly, paying for the construction of the satellites, paying for the launches, and then selling back to the government. So that this is, in a way, it's not new. The private sector has been part of space from the very beginning in the United States. The way they operate, the way they, with the government, has changed and will change. And some of that's a natural progression of the maturity of the technology. We're no longer so much in some areas in the research and development. We're always trying to do better, but we have operational satellites, and they are business entities that can sell back to individuals and to the government, but they need a license. So the government can also direct how they operate and be involved in the safety of their operations.
Now, unfortunately, that's all the time we have today with Professor Logner and Professor Hertzfeld. It's a shame because there's really many audience questions that we didn't get a chance to get to, but I'm sure everyone will agree that it's been a real privilege to hear about astropolitics from two professors who are so knowledgeable about the topic. Thank you both so much for coming to talk to us today. Thank you all again for coming to today's In Conversation with event. This concludes session 2. May all ICDelf students now please go onto the YFS website and find the link for the closing ceremony.